Welcome to Michigan Justice Chronicles with Dan Geherin.
Hey everyone, welcome back to an all-new episode of Michigan Justice Chronicles with board-certified criminal trial attorney Dan Geherin. I am your host, Mike Leon. You know, over the last month in Minneapolis, some of the most high-profile criminal justice cases have occurred in the shooting deaths of Renee Good and Alex Pretti by federal ICE agents out in Minnesota. There was also a police-involved shooting of an unarmed citizen in Washtenaw County that is getting a lot of attention. Dan's going to break all of this down as a former prosecutor and board-certified criminal justice attorney. Dan, it is good to see you as always. You know, we mentioned the two national cases, and we're going to get into the other one that happened around Ann Arbor. Can you kind of give for the audience a little bit of the background and facts and understanding? Let's do the Minneapolis ones first with respect to Renee Good and Alex Pretti.
Absolutely, Mike. Thank you for having me. You know, this is a heavy topic, right? And it's on the minds of most Americans. And, you know, you talk about scary, you talk about sad, you talk about tragic and everything in between. You know, this is the type of case in the criminal justice system that I'm always very curious about. And the justice system is certainly keeping its eye on. But like you said, by way of background, the Minnesota case, you had two civilians killed by federal ICE or Border Patrol agents. The first, Renee Good, was in her car and was allegedly driving at an agent at the time. She was shot several times and killed. And then just a week later, the gentleman was in the street, sort of got into an argument with Border Patrol and ICE agents, went down to the ground. They were on top of him. They thought or said that he had a gun, which was true up until they took it from him, and they shot him. So two very, as I said, sad, tragic events that unfolded on camera that the world can see. And then just recently, in the beginning of January, several local Washtenaw County sheriff's deputies shot a man after a police chase, and they believed he was armed, and it turned out he was not. It was a situation in which the 911 caller had said he was armed and dangerous. They, in their minds, apparently believed he had a gun. And it's been revealed that this young man was a military veteran, maybe had some mental health history, but certainly did not have a weapon at the time he lost his life. So not only locally are we dealing with the potential fallout of police officers being charged with crimes and all that comes with that, but on a bigger sense, all of us in the justice system and all of us who are humans are following the Minnesota cases pretty carefully.
Yeah. It's sad all around what's happening. And like I said, I'm glad that you tied it from a federal and obviously state and local perspective. Let me ask you, though, because obviously each of them is different. And we know on the federal side with respect to Renee Good, Alex Pretti, whether or not we'll get some type of investigation. State officials have been kind of blocked off on each of those endpoints. And then you can kind of speak a little bit more about the Washtenaw County shooting. But what are some charges, consequences that could come, because these are officers obviously operating on the Washtenaw County one, state local perspective, the federal one, that's DHS. So what are some charges or potential consequences that could come across these cases?
Yeah, you broke it down the right way. I think to analyze that question, you have to first talk about the Minnesota case, right? So the Minnesota cases, I should say, you've got three potential prosecuting agencies, for lack of a better word. The most unlikely on the top of that mountain would be federal civil rights violations, called a 1983 action. If the police acted excessively, they could be charged with violating each of those decedents' civil rights. And there could be a federal civil rights prosecution. Probably the most famous would be the officers who killed Mr. Floyd in Minnesota back around the COVID time. And then in the Rodney King beating in the early 90s, those were federal civil rights prosecutions. But as I understand it, that unit of the Department of Justice has been largely gutted, and the chances of prosecution are not good there. Then you could just have federal prosecutors bringing federal homicide or common law murder or manslaughter charges against the federal agents. You could lastly have the state Minnesota prosecutors bring prosecutions under state law, saying you have acted outside of what is acceptable as police officers, and you have committed common law murder or manslaughter. In the Washtenaw County case, you still could have civil rights violations, highly unlikely. Here, you could have homicide or manslaughter charges. It wouldn't be brought by our local prosecutor, Washtenaw County. they would recuse themselves because they work every day with the sheriff's department. And instead, it would likely be the attorney general's office looking at potential charges. And like you asked, Mike, you're talking about either second-degree murder, unpremeditated murder, or perhaps most likely manslaughter charges in all of these incidents.
Yeah. I've spoken with other former federal prosecutors, state prosecutors that have been involved in police style shootings. The biggest through line I hear is that, was it a justified shoot or not, right? With respect to this. Dan, given that, what are some possible defenses? And again, I know it's a little bit different each situation, one involving a vehicle, one involving, pepper spray that was deployed and 6 officers on top of one. And then obviously whatever happened with the Washtenaw County one, they're all different. But what are some possible defenses that the officers could rely on if they are eventually charged with any type of crimes?
You started with the right phrase, justifiable shoot. Let's put it into legalese, right? It's, did they act in self-defense or defense of others? So police, like us, like civilians, have the right to use deadly force, in this case, shooting their guns, if they have an honest and objectable, reasonable belief that their lives or lives of others are in imminent risk of death or great bodily harm. Now, with police, they have to look at, did they use all reasonable means first? Are they trained properly? Were there other methods they could have used instead of deadly force? Is it a reasonable act under the circumstances? And you hit it on the head. All 3 of these are a little bit different. Case 1, they'd say, she was driving at me. I had to shoot to prevent being run over. Some debate on the video on whether that car was just trying to get away, coming at him, whether he needed to shoot. And that will be the $1 million question there. Second case, they thought he had a gun because one of the deputies or agents said gun, but I think they were probably saying, we're removing his gun from his waistband. And that was a mistaken belief that they thought someone yelled gun, that he had one. And then thirdly, here in Washtenaw County, the 911 caller allegedly said this person was armed and dangerous and had a weapon. I'll be curious to see what the deputies here thought they saw when they approached his car. For your benefit, Mike, just to give a visual, they had rammed this person's car. His car had flipped over. He was upside down in the driver's seat at the time they came around and shot him. So be curious to hear what they saw or thought they saw or heard to justify, we need to shoot to protect ourselves.
Yeah. Let's stay on that for a second, because the latter 2 that you mentioned both involve a gun that police thought the person had. So what happens there? Because again, ultimately it was a death in the Alex Pretti case. Like, police accidentally believed in both of these instances that someone had a weapon, but they've made a mistake. What happens now?
That is a great question. And that is, as I said a second ago, to use a bad cliche, the $1 million question, right? Because the standard in both federal and state level defense is going to be, were they acting reasonable at the time, right? You can't go back and play Monday morning quarterback and say, well, now I would think it was not reasonable because there's no gun found in the overturned car, or the gun had been taken from the male on the ground. But at the time, what did the officers think or know? And was that reasonable? So let's break down each. If it's the officers in quick, fast time are taking the gun from him, someone's yelling gun, and then they shoot, you could make an argument that that was simply a mistake and that the word gun caused a reaction, and it was simply, under the circumstances, a reasonable reaction. And then in the Washtenaw County case, I'm sure they would say, the 911 caller told us there was a gun, but that's different. They must have seen or thought they saw something. Otherwise, that's a bigger stretch to say, we thought he had a gun, even though there was nothing in his hand. He didn't have anything fashioned as a gun. So if they made a mistake and it was a reasonable mistake, they still could be either found not guilty or not charged. If they made a mistake and a trier of fact, a jury says that wasn't reasonable, you're looking at convictions at the very least for manslaughter.
Dan, our opinions mean only so much to the 12 potential jurors that would be sitting in a box deliberating on this. So how do juries tend to view these cases from your lens?
Big shocker here, right? Our entire country is divided. Neighbors and all have different opinions. You might talk 50 people listen to this podcast. 25 may say, their cops need to be convicted, and 25 may say that, they did nothing wrong. And that's sort of a political bent, philosophical ideals, and just differing political opinions. And jurors are no different. Even though you might be in a progressive town like I am, Ann Arbor, and you think we have very progressive jurors, you still may have some that say, I back the police no matter what. Older jurors tend to tend in that direction. And so it is a tough question to ask when you're talking about such a political thing in Minnesota and you're talking about loss of life. That all said, jurors tend to give police officers the discount. They're trained, they're wearing their badges, they mean well, they didn't set out to hurt someone. There is sort of that discount, and it is tough to convict police officers. But boy, have we seen examples where that is starting to erode away, and jurors are starting to lose their patience with officers who shoot first and ask questions later. Now, especially if you have jurors who don't like the federal intrusion of ICE agents or Border Patrol in their cities in Minnesota, or here locally, if they say, you've got to stop killing people out there. This may be sort of a tide in how jurors are changing, but it is still difficult to convict police officers of these cases.
So we've talked about the criminal implications, and again, we don't know what will happen as of this recording with respect to the investigations in Renee Good and Alex Pretti. But let me ask you about civil implications, lawsuits that could come out of this. Do you see anything like that coming out of each of the respective cases, not only in Minneapolis, but in Ann Arbor?
Working backwards to your question, in Ann Arbor, literally a week ago, an attorney in Detroit came out in the press and said, we are bringing potential wrongful death charges against the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department and the deputies involved. So that is rolling as we speak. So what that means is we are bringing a civil lawsuit, not a criminal case, against the county that employed these deputies and against the deputies individually to say, you wrongfully killed our client. And you get a class of family members, typically parents, spouse, sisters, brothers, that are part of the wrongful death action. And there, the standard of proof is lower. There, the standard of proof is a preponderance of evidence, typically, much lower than a criminal beyond a reasonable doubt. And they'd have to show that their actions took this person's life wrongfully. And then you're talking about a financial settlement as opposed to prison and jail. In Minnesota, you already have sort of grumblings that both families are looking to sue the federal government and do the things we talked about before, wrongful deaths. Now, it's important for me to note, Mike, that police agencies have what is called immunity, governmental immunity. It is tough to sue police departments in counties or states or governments that employ police, because generally people employed in those capacities doing their jobs are protected. But if they go so far beyond, if they are grossly negligent and beyond what is acceptable, that is where you pierce the immunity, and that is where there could be significant recovery. So I'm going to guess we're going to have 3 wrongful death cases, whether or not we have charges or convictions in the criminal realm.
Well, staying on that, and as we kind of land the plane on this episode, you gave the civil cases there in the prognostication, but put the prognosticator hat back on, the Lee Corso fathead, and tell me what you think about, from the criminal perspective, do we get investigations? I know there's rumblings on the Alex Pretti front, but do we get investigations with Renee Good, with Alex Pretti? Do we get criminal charges brought against any of the officers, whether it be ones from Custom Border Patrol, ICE, or the ones out in the Ann Arbor?
Just for my own 2 cents, you felt the political pressure really mount after Alex Pretti was killed. And you saw action taken by the government and removal of ICE and some of the comments that were made, I think, because, what you have is a sense that crossed a line. And so I would predict that those officers involved in his shooting are going to be charged with manslaughter or potential second-degree murder by the U.S. government. You didn't hear as much back cry on Renee Good. You sort of heard a lot of people saying, well, she was rabble-rousing and she aimed at the car. And you didn't hear the same sort of, disdain from political figures. So if I were predicting, I'd say they'd claim he acted in self-defense because there's only one shooter and probably wouldn't be charged. Here in Washtenaw County, not enough facts are out, but when you shoot an unarmed man, a military veteran who's upside down in his car, had no weapon in his car, and you're talking about the Attorney General's office, a very progressive, some might say anti-police prosecutor, at least in office for the next 6 to 7 months. I'm predicting they're going to get charged with at least manslaughter here locally.
Dan, thank you so much for the time, the insights, breaking down all of these events that are happening, not only in your state, Michigan, but in Minnesota. I appreciate it as always, my friend.
Appreciate you having me, Mike. Heavy topics indeed, but I'm happy to sort of give my 2 cents, and for whatever that's worth, I appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone out there for listening to this installment of the Michigan Justice Chronicles with board-certified criminal trial attorney Dan Geherin. Do me a favor, if you want to connect with Dan and his team, go to glgmichigan.com. And one more favor before you go: like, subscribe, leave a review, comment, share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. I am Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.